What's going on, coders? Welcome to another episode of Building a Full Stack App CRUD app full stack MERN. Too many buzzwords. Who cares anyway? Y'all know why you're here if you're this deep in the playlist. We're picking up where we left off with our login component, doing some cool stuff with handling multiple inputs from one handle change function and doing a login request and realizing that probably writing this code out right here, this fetch request, over and over and over again, remembering to apply the correct method, headers, and body will be a giant pain in the rear, which it will be. So we need to instead focus on, you know, we need to focus on seeing if we can't move this code to be a bit easier, maybe into some kind of, I don't know, service file of some kind, where we can have like a local place where we write our general fetch requests to be set up the way we need them to be set up. And that way we can clean up all this business logic and networking logic away from our React code. I need to repaint my nails. Damn, these things look nasty. But it's like a week's worth of just growing out and scratches and whatnot. Don't know why I'm commenting on that and leaving this in without an edit. But yeah, so, like we need to try and, minimize the business logic away from our components, because otherwise our components code gets pretty bloated and hard to read. But, we had it going pretty well here. We had a official login. If we hit local storage, evidently I keep mistyping the auto complete. We have a token stored here, and like I said, this is not the best way to do things. This is going to be opening up to a couple typical attacks about like especially if you get like cross-scripted or something like that, they can pick up things out of local storage and potentially use it against you. But for a side project like this, it's totally fine. And again, if you're interested, let me know in the comments below. By the way, like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the description below to get involved with Covalence on our Discord channel. If you want more in-depth auth stuff, I can do that. But for this project here, this is going to be good enough where we store a token here and we just ask our server to validate it to make sure it's indeed legit. Now, the question of when you want to do that is going to be our next thought process, because I need to build some kind of component that is going to be added to my list of routes, or rather an element that wraps a private page, to, well, indeed check to make sure that it is a privatized component. Meaning, should the user even be able to navigate to the private component if they are not even logged in? If they're not logged in, it should redirect them back to login, maybe with some kind of message, or not. Depends on what you want to do for your user experience. Typically, that's a good idea. If they are authenticated, or they're authorized rather, because authentication is like confirming your credentials, and authorizing is saying, this is who I claim to be, and they can get it authorized. If they're authorized to view this page, they should be able to do so. So at a very fundamental low level, we can, this is not the best way to do it. Again, I'm showing y'all different ways of approaching the problem here. We can bring in the useEffect hook from the React library and say, hey, useEffect on initial page load, when they first get here, we need to check if they are even allowed to be here. Now, again, remember, effects are consequences of renders. So theoretically, the user will first see this div with an h1 of private appearing or something like that. This will render, and the second this render is done, the effect will then fire as a consequence of the render, right? That's what use effects are. That's what effects are. Think of them as consequences of renders. So no matter what, even with the use effect with your empty array dependency here, meaning this array dependency is what dictates when this effect will or if ever will rerun again. An empty array will always be an empty array when it compares it between renders, which means this effect will only run after the initial render and then never again, which is why we're going to include the empty array there. We need to have some kind of logic that says, should they even be here? Because if not, then let's move them somewhere else. So we could do the following. Local storage, I don't know what I called the key. I think it was just token. Get the token from local storage. If no token exists, meaning if it attempts to pull from local storage this token and it doesn't exist, then it should reroute our user in some form or fashion. So we can do that in a declarative way by saying import from React Router DOM the navigate component, and we can say return navigate. Actually, no, we can't do that here because I'd have to have I need to return it as JSX. So, I mean, logically, this is a synchronous action, meaning we can just check this outside of a use effect. Hold on. There's a couple different ways we could do this. I'm going to leave the use effect in there, and even though it does nothing, it doesn't really matter too much. We can say that we want to pull the token in as a local variable because we don't care to have it stored in state or as a ref or anywhere. We're just checking to see if it exists. If no token exists, then we can return some different JSX, which will be our declarative component. This is what I was trying to say. To /login. And that's at a minimum what needs to happen. So this actually avoids the problem I was presenting with using a use effect, because again, use effect will occur after the first or initial render, whatever you want to call it. That means they would see the privatized page's components. It probably wouldn't be of any use until an actual fetch request of data happens, like a profile page, for example. So maybe you just have like a loading page appear at first while it does this check. And if it happens to be the case, then we say, hey, return a new navigate component that navigates us to login if no token is present. So localStorage.get item of token with nothing there should return undefined, which is, a falsy value. So we say if it's not falsy, meaning there is no token, then return that component. Let's refresh the page. We know, because I've tested this, that there is something in local storage. So if I click on private, I get there no problem. Let's now clear local storage and go back to home and now click on private. That's peculiar. Did I save the component? I did. There is no token in local storage is my thought process here. If I ask it to get the local storage token, it returns null. Opposite of not null is indeed undefined. So I'm curious as to why my private component did not navigate away when that token was not found. The path should be /login. What do we got going on here, folks? It's running. That makes sense. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, classic blunder when I was getting ready for this video. Okay. So, I'm pretty sure the code is fine as written. The reason it is not occurring here, this is not a planned learning opportunity, but I like to leave my errors in and not edit them out, even if I look like an idiot. Or if I have some, I'll edit out dead air if there is any. But this one's a good one. All right, so I got all my windows open to do this week's recording of video. So I got all the windows or applications we've been using for this playlist: MySQL Workbench, Postman, VS Code, my Commander terminal, and Google Chrome now, since we're working on the front end. I got it all up and running. I CD'd into my project. As you can see, I opened up my code editor and I wrote my production run script, which is npm start. npm start, if you recall, if you go back to our package JSON from when we built this way back in the day. That was peculiar. Oh, I was messing with the README and putting in stuff. Okay, yeah. In the package JSON, our start script simply runs node on disk server JS. It has no logic of recompiling or rebundling our project. I'm used to working in things like create React app or next, where just the start script is your dev script. And sure enough, I made the classic gaff, and blunder. Because this is not recompiling, it is not making any changes and compiling and bundling a new client side, which means it is still reflecting my old written code that did not have that if statement with the return in it, with the return navigate in it. Well, now that I'm running npm run dev, it actually did recompile my code, and it should be available to view in the browser. Let's try that again from the home page. Click on private, and we're redirected to the login page successfully. Now, there's some cool trickery you could do, some chicanery, if you will, some trickery. With this navigate component, there are additional bits of information. Like, I know there is a prop called replace, where its presence simply means true. You'll see some TypeScript and React developers say that they don't like these props that are, hey, if it exists, it's true. If it doesn't exist, it's false. I don't mind it like that, but a lot of the times they will say specifically write your value, your Boolean value, as true or false, so you don't have a bunch of hidden optional props on your component that you have no idea what it does, right? That will replace any other paths that are going on inside of there to make sure we arrive to the correct location. You can even do something cool like this. There is a neat hook from React Router DOM called use location, where we can grab a component's location. So we can say, hey, location equals a call to the use location hook. And let's console log what this sucker looks like real quick so y'all can see what I'm getting at here. Cool. Boom. Private. Right, so we have where our location is coming from. So we can even do something akin to this where we say, now you see here this prop on the navigate component called to. This is where obviously we are navigating to, and it takes a string value of a path, but you can actually pass along some additional information with this particular little trick here. So we can say, instead of to just passing it a string, you can pass it an object. Now remember folks, the outer set of curly braces is escaping the JSX. The inner set of curly braces is the actual JavaScript object that we are providing our path name of where this is going to, which would be, well, the /login page. We're in an object, folks. That's colons. There we go. And now you can also pass along some state of information to that component. Now you'll see individuals do this a lot. Well, they will write the following information. Well, they will say state. Oh, what are you messing with me here? It doesn't exist, you say. Well, it should. Hold on here. That's interesting that they've changed the typing on this. Because we're inside. I mean, you recognize path name, I'm pretty sure. Hold on. They recognize path name, right? Yeah, recognize path name, which was /login, like I wanted. And we should be able to pass along a prop called state along with this component. That's interesting that it doesn't recognize that. Type to object literal, mainly specify known properties. State does not exist in type partial path. It doesn't? Have they changed some information here on React Router v6? I looked at their docs this morning to make sure I was fairly up to date with things, but that doesn't seem to be the case. We're going to put an earmark in this because while TypeScript may not be happy about it, it should be fine to do. Let's just do this real quick. Let's just go ahead and... yeah, I mean, that's the object right there for the to object. Path name and state should be a value that we can do whatever we want on, so hold on here. Let's see what we can glean here. By ignoring the TypeScript error for now to see if there's just an issue with the TypeScript types, which I never looked at what they installed. The types may just be out of sync. Yeah, that's what happened. Okay. That's interesting that their TypeScript types are not up to date with their newest version. And I don't recall getting an error on the React Router DOM types giving me trouble with the versioning differences. Hold on here. I'm going to pause the video for a second and go look at the repository for the TypeScript types and figure out if there is a new version and why install the old version. And we're back from the edit, and I love minor API changes here, folks. They are my absolute favorite when tiny little changes to the API are done and I have to go double check what I'm actually looking at here. So yeah, go figure. That they moved it out from the to object path name state syntax to simply providing a prop on the navigate component itself called state. We need to also probably get rid of the old TypeScript typings from the version 5 I have installed, but we'll deal with that in just a minute here and go figure this is what, like, again, it's a minor API difference. Like, I looked at their examples in their own repository and it was written the previous way. I found some code sandboxes that were v6 React Router DOM that had it written the previous way, and it's just evidently some version difference between 6.1 or 2 or whatever, where I've done this before, or like their own examples and code sandboxes we're using, and this latest version changes that API difference right there. I think that's my biggest gripe with the React Router DOM is they tend to, like, every year screw up their own API, or like break their own API with deprecating or weird changes. I feel like they make changes for the sake of making changes somehow, because I've had to re-record our React Router DOM content in our full stack curriculum more than twice, which is kind of crazy to think about. But anyway, like I was saying, there's some cool things you could do here with state where we can say, we can provide a from location, state.from, and that will provide us some information about where the navigate came from, which is cool information to know. So on the login page, we can also grab that information to display it down the line, where we can grab it, and let's go ahead and do something like that. Yeah, let's do that. Let's bring in the import from React Router DOM. We're going to bring in our hook, our use location hook. I'm pretty sure is the one we want here. Yeah. Use location, and we're going to bring that hook in here to our component, and we'll simply console log that value to see if we can see that information that we brought from the other component here, right? So let's try this all over again here, folks. On the first render of the login page, yeah, we just get location, path name, and no state here, as you can see, because we just refresh on the login page. It has a location via that use location hook that has no state because we've had no logic and we provided no state when navigating to here just from the page itself, right? Now, if I click on private and get rerouted back to login, we'll see that now, look at the location console log. It does have, as you can see, a state object that has a property called from that tells us where it came from along with any other information, right? So we've basically daisy chained along where the information came from on this path name, and you could use a lot of cool like pseudo logic to provide some like error text that says, hey, you must, if it came from the path of private, you must be logged in to view this page. So let's go ahead and see how we could do that here, right? So we could provide, for example, like underneath the form, but inside of the div maybe, where we have a quick test to say, hey, if location, which we know will be truthy because no matter what, it's going to have a location, has a state property, right? And if that state property is defined, it should have a from property that will have a path name property. And if that path name property equals / private as a value, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So it's location.state.from.pathname, location.state. This is where we check to make sure that it's not null. This is an optional, what is it? Goodness, what is it called? Optional operator, right? It's like it was, for a while, it was like a TypeScript only thing, but now I think it's just in mainstream JavaScript, where this optional chain operator will say, hey, is location.state truthy? If so, then continue the daisy chain of .from.pathname because we should be safe to do so. If it's not truthy, then ignore chaining .from.pathname because it's going to throw an error, right? Because location.state, if that value is null, then chaining on .from will say, hey, .from is not a property of null. That's an error because null is, well, null. It doesn't have a property called .from. So that optional chain operator can give us some cool things we could do right there to say if they came from private. We can do this as a short circuit, meaning if this whole thing returns true, then it will go to the right-hand side of the short circuit to see what it needs to return or do, which could be a div that has some color and text in it that says, you must be logged in, sucker, or something like that. You get yourself some kind of message to say, hey, if they happen to get here from a path name of private, you must be logged in, because you don't want that always to appear no matter what, meaning if I refresh on logged in, oh, okay, the refresh login remembers that I came from that path of private. That's interesting that it remembered that there between refreshes. Normally, all that state stuff is lost upon a refresh, but that's pretty cool to know. Let's try that again, where I go to login. There we go. There is no state, so there is no need to display that message. But if I click on private and it reroutes me back to login, boom, we get a nice little UX, user experience right there, telling them you must be logged in to view this page. You all seen this a million times on the web, all over the place, right? Okay, and honestly, we can even say that if it has any location state at all, they probably got here via that. So we have to also be looking at that, right? So, okay, cool. And you could also do this via state control. Like I did this via, if it simply exists and something like that, you could get fancy and even have like a local state variable that you set to true when that error happens or something like that. But I think this solution is just fine in itself here, right? So yeah, I like it. Simple, simple, simple. So next, what I was moving on towards is like, this is going to be a very annoying if statement to have to remember to place every single time we decide to do this. So we have a couple of tricks that we could do. Like I said, the use effect, it had that issue of the initial render, whereas this will return a declarative style React component. And by declarative versus imperative, I mean declarative is like, I tell you what I want to happen, and then it just you kind of figure it out from there. Imperative would be writing down a list of instructions to the grocery store where I list everything you need to do. Get your keys off the counter, go into your garage if you have one. Although, just go to your car, start your car, drive this many miles to the grocery store. It's like that's imperative programming where you write every single thing that has to happen in order to achieve a particular end. Imperative routing, for example, could be something like using another hook called use navigate or something like that, that will use code like JavaScript logic to tell our components how to change where they're supposed to go, versus declarative is like this. This is what JSX is all about, saying, hey, I didn't say it, I declared it. We are writing a declarative statement that says this is what needs to happen, and it kind of figures out the code for us from there, which is typically a preferred upon approach for accessibility and just writing JSX in general, right? This declarative approach right here. But like I was saying, this isn't also super solid because for all we know, that token could be expired, right? If that token's expired, then what good is it going to do us anyway? Or what if it's like a bunk token, for example? So, our logic here could be the following. Again, this is not where we're going to end up in this video playlist. I'm just like introducing some auth concepts for y'all to consider here, right? So we can say, hey, what if they got this far with a expired or bunk token? How are we going to know that they should be able to stay here? What do I mean by that? Let's take a look actually before I go any further. Let's go to local storage, and we are going to clear it out. We're also going to set an item called token with a value of a bunch of gobbledygook. That is our fake token. We're trying to hack our own website to see what happens here. I'm going to set that item to state and call it into private, and boom, I've hacked our website already. I'm on this private page with a fake token. There's nothing you can do to stop me. Though there is something we can do to stop this particular behavior from happening. Again, like, okay, they got to the page, but any subsequent fetch request to our server on a private endpoint that needs to check and validate this token would ultimately fail anyway, and they'll just see an errored or crashed page, right? Now, our users could theoretically do something dumb and get to this point as well and let us know that, hey, the page is crashing when you realize they have some bunk token or expired token that for some reason didn't get caught by your code or something like that. But, this is like a common way of trying to get around stuff. So, while it does get you to the component view, the subsequent requests that this private page would make, like let's say if it was a user's profile page, this token would clearly not retrieve somebody's profile. And if it did, we have some serious issues to work out. Here's what I mean by that. We had that, if you recall, auth endpoint over here where we had a validate token to auth validate me. My fun name for it, we can say validate /me. It's a get request by default. But we are going to provide a headers object that has that, if you recall, authorization key with not content type bearer and the token itself. So let's go ahead and grab that token here. Yeah, I mean, every time the component re-renders, this variable will be recreated, but it doesn't really matter for our case here. So we're going to put that in the scope, make sure that's in the scope of this use effect, and change this to be a template literal. So now we're going to get that token and apply it to our request headers. And if that happens to succeed, we're then going to... Oh, how did I manage to type too many parentheses like that, folks? Don't know what happened there. Okay. And with the res, we're going to console log it. Oh, that's what happened. Yeah, that's why I messed up here. There we go. I was like, something seems off here. But remember, the error here is not going to help us too much because like I mentioned in the previous video, the way fetch handles errors is not how you would think. It actually will still consider them a valid response and leave the code of writing the error handling logic to you, the user. Let's go ahead and see what this does with the component now. So like I said, they have, if you recall, a bunk token currently in storage that gets us through, the client-side protection we have of, hey, if they have a token in storage, they should be able to see this page. But like I said, that gets you only to this next step that fails anyway, saying, hey, the validation of this token failed anyway, so they're on currently a broken page, even if they did hack us with a bunk token like this, right? So, that's some things to keep in mind, that this is how you can handle things, and this seems like, very, very redundant code to have to include, like these lines of code being included in almost every single component, right, would be very annoying. And by the way, like if you wanted to handle this from a fetch perspective, we would have to say if they got a status code of 401, I mean, whether it's up here or not. So like, remember, this is where we parse the JSON body, which is where this message object came from. So either we could check against that and whatever our messages happen to be from our server, or we can always do one of the following where we can say, we don't really care about the message, so we can just provide some code that says if res.status does not equal 200, that means something most certainly went wrong. Shorthands, there we go. If the res status is not 200, or 200 okay is what I think our server should respond with when it's valid. Nope, it's expired here. Let's get a new token for testing in Postman right now. I'm making sure my status code is 200 okay. in the event we have a good token. Gucci 200 okay. Yeah, so if it's anything other than 200 okay, then we can, for example, use that, like I had said, that hook, because I can't use any kind of declarative JSX right here, but I can use a hook, and we could call that one, I'm pretty sure it's use navigate these days. Yeah, it recognizes it. And that way we can also bring in, and this is the opposite side. So this is not declarative coding. This is now imperative coding. You see, we have a whole bunch of very specifically listed steps on how to run this code. Navigate, and I think navigate is a function that we pass in a string value to of where it needs to go to. So yeah, there we go. And we can provide options like state from and things like that over here. So I'm assuming that this is where I'd provide if it had a state. Yeah, that's where we provide it in the navigate function. And so this is imperative coding. This is declarative coding, right? So yeah, that's something you could take into consideration. That way you can have your users, should they not be here, rerouted back to the login page because you got unauthorized via a bad hacky token in local storage here, right? But let's go ahead and get back into a good token and log in private. And as you can see, we are good to go. I don't have any, dang it, I just cleared it out. Log in, please, log in, private, we're good to go. Local storage should now have a valid, non-expired, written by our server token that we can validate. As you can see, the private request here did not fail, and I did not get navigated because this check also passed. The token not only exists, but is also valid. You could combine these kind of in a step where if you wanted some like local state to stay loading, and then after this check finishes, it sets that state to true, that turns the loader off, and then displays the page and whatever private information is now there from that particular token. But like I said, this will start to reek of dry, do not repeat yourself. When you find yourself having to write all of this code across every single component every single time, as y'all imagine, that's going to be very annoying to deal with. As well as writing this fetch request and having to apply the token in this manner every single time will also be a very annoying process. So we have a couple of options in order to, well, solve this, right? I am going to choose to first write what I'm going to call my base service, if you will, right? I like doing this on a lot of my projects because, again, having to deal with all this fetch nonsense all over the place can get very annoying, right? I want it to make no matter what, take that response and parse it out for a message of some kind or handle certain status codes in one central location, what I typically dub as my single source of truth. I want one place that is going to make all my fetch requests. And we have two choices. Write it ourselves, which I'm going to choose to do, but I'll talk about the pitfalls behind that because there's so much logic you have to end up dealing with, or quality of life and features that come with using, well, a library like React Fetch or something like that, right? Or React Query, I think, is one of the really, really popular ones. Like those kinds of libraries are freaking awesome, and I use them in my normal projects because, again, they have all of your edge cases and quality of life already added in for you in these like custom hook libraries that can make fetch requests, handle reroutes, handle errors properly, handle parsing of data correctly for you, and even handling some basic state like error and loading states out of the box, all written for us. It is simply fantastic. But again, this playlist series is teaching y'all to write stuff from scratch and not just rely on tons and tons and tons of libraries, which you are more than welcome to change up and use after you kind of figure out where I'm going with this. So like I said, we're gonna take the caveman unga bunga approach and write it ourselves and realize the pitfalls that come with it, but you'll learn more about how these other libraries may or may not be written. So we're going to add a new folder somewhere in my client-side folder. We're going to call it services. This service is going to be, well, to make fetch requests for us. So I will write a new file name. We'll call this base.ts as my base service. That's going to be the point we're doing here. This is also somewhere where I would write the following. I would write some kind of root URL variable. Now, I know this is doable in React apps, and I haven't actually done it or goofed with it too much before when it came to writing my own React code, like not using Create React App or Next.js or something like that. But, like this is where you could provide, if you needed to, some kind of logic that will allow you to change the root URL depending on whether you are in production or in development, right? And that's the case when you have like a separated project where you would have developing on localhost 3000 on your machine versus, like maybe you have a server deployed to mycoolserver.com and then you have mycoolwebsite.com. They're two different root URLs, which means you'd have trouble switching between like whether you're doing the server or localhost values, right? So if I had like a decoupled project, this is where I would include a root URL variable that would change on an environment variable. Again, when it comes to client-side code, you can't actually hide anything in environment variables. Anyone can see it. So this is simply meant to be a switcher variable for the project to correctly talk to the correct server. But because our server and website are in the same place, I don't got to worry about that. All right, so here is what I'm finna say. Let's say we're going to have a function, and I think I've been doing arrow functions across my project for everything, if I'm not mistaken, even at the root level. We're going to call it makeFetch, and it's going to take a URL string, and it'll take an info object, which I have no idea what we're going to strong type that is for now, and it's literally just going to say return fetch to our URL. This is where I do like root URL plus info and pass that info along into the fetch request right there. And I realize I just I goofed up and wrote it in two different ways there, trying to think that out loud. Okay, cool. Now this is useful when you have to do something like the following, when we did have that root URL, right? When we had root URL plus whatever URL we're passing in here. So honestly, this might be redundant for the way I'm approaching this particular project. But I wanted to point out that you could combine these functions however you need to, right? So now that is there and ready to go, we can now have a const. I'm going to call this JSON, and it will be a function as well. Like I said, I've been mixing and matching async and await, which is not my favorite thing to do, but I'll be using async on this one just to be able to write my code kind of like in a pseudo-synchronous fashion right here, right? So we're going to have a URL that will have a string, a method that will have a string, and it will have a body who will be, well, honestly, whatever object we want it to be. Ultimately, if we're sending JSON data, it's typically going to be an object that has a key string with a string or possible number. It doesn't really matter what it is here, right? But more than likely, it'll just be a lot of those happening right here. Oh, that's right. I don't have a root URL at the moment. Okay. So the purpose of this guy here, and I'm defaulting this to be an empty body initially. That way I don't get any kind of weird errors or things like that, right? I don't want to have to provide this body arg. This is how we're going to make it optional here in TypeScript. I could also just do the following, saying it's an optional argument that doesn't have to be there like that, where I can say, hey, I don't have to provide it if I don't want to. That's something you can do in TypeScript, not in vanilla JavaScript. The equals curly braces, the assigning it an empty object like that would be the vanilla JS approach of making it an optional argument. But we're going to take that approach right now. We're going to say we need to get our token. And you know what? Speaking of token, like I said, I hate to do this, but I want to take a pause here, and I want to say that it might be useful to also have some kind of utility that manages how we get set and clear our tokens, right? Now, that logic is very easy, right? We've done it several times already when it came to localStorage.getItem, right? But again, you might want to centralize this logic somewhere, again, single source of truth, in order for us to easily get the token across our entire project. If we want to change the key, we have one place to do so, not multiple. Like if token or some other property needs to get changed, like maybe the website or place you're deploying to, I don't know, maybe you don't want to use token in production and you want to change it. You wouldn't want to have to go to your 15 different components that say localStorage.getAtom token to do that. You would want one place to do so. So in terms of that, we can also make another folder called utilities or utils, whatever you want. And in utilities, I might have like a storage.ts. And inside of here, I would have simple things like const get token, right? Yeesh. That will simply run const token equals local storage dot get item. And here's where the magic sauce happens. This file is where we would declare something like this. Token underscore key equals token. And now we can make it whatever we want. But now we have one central variable in our project that dictates what that token key is going to be in order to, say, return it or do things like that, right? Not return true, return the token. Right? And then const remove token would be local storage dot remove item and provide that token key as our remove item. And if that happens to work, we can return true or something like that, just so it has a return value that we can goof with should we need to. But yeah, that's just something to keep in mind here, that we can have like a central place. Again, this is very simple, but it could be useful in production. I've used stuff like this before, and this is a common pattern you'll see. So I have like one variable in my project that dictates what that token key is going to be under, that can make it much more consistent across my components to get and retrieve tokens, right? So now I can say, I want to export them individually or by, we can call it tokens. You can say export defaults get token, comma, remove token. Considering I did this kind of approach in my backend rather than named exports, I'm going to choose to do it with the default one here, which means over yonder I can now import storage from up one utilities storage, and from there I can say, hey, storage dot get token for me, and that way it should return the token if it's found in local storage for us here, right? Then I can set up my headers where I can say it's going to be an object that will at the very minimum have content type application JSON, because most of my requests will probably, if they have a body, then, well, you know, again, like, technically I don't need to add that if I don't have a body of any kind. So we can even have, like, preparing our headers here in case we need to do so, right? Because if it's a get request, you know, that's what we're going to do. Watch this. I'm going to choose to take this approach. I'm going to prepare, because put and post requests will be the more complex ones. I'm going to say that we're going to generate our headers, right? And we're going to say if token is true, meaning it found one in local storage, on that headers object, I need to add a key of authorization and assign it a value of bearer and our token that we got from local storage if it existed. That way it will add the token if it exists. So that way we can get it validated with our private endpoint, whatever that happens to be. Okay. Now, we can say our data object or our options object that's going to be given to our fetch request ultimately has to have some headers. It's got to have a method, you know, so in order of arguments, we'll do method. Headers, if any, needed to get added, and also our body, which will be a JSON.stringify of whatever body arg we happen to pass in with that optional argument, which is typically why, like I said, stringifying an undefined body might give us an error, so that way I might make this, you know, an arg, but provide it with a argument like an empty object argument, because that won't throw an error trying to stringify an empty body, for example, here. But here's the kicker. What I was trying to get at is technically we don't have to have a headers of content type or a body property on this object for get requests, because even though Postman will allow it, you do not provide body properties for GET request, it'll actually not work that way. And we also, we don't need the headers or the body on our configuration here. So we can say if the method that this argument is a GET request, right? If it's a GET request to this JSON function, then we can ask it to please delete from the headers the content type property and delete from the data object the body property because it doesn't need to be there on GET request, right? So those two can be deleted for like this little micro optimization for what we're doing here. Not that super huge of a deal, but just things to keep in mind, right? So from there, we can continue and finally say a try catch block, right? Where if there an error happens, maybe we can throw the error up one level or do whatever we want with it. It doesn't really matter what we do with it. But here's where we would say const response equals await make fetch to our URL with data attached to it, right? That's why, just kind of clearing up some stuff here. That info object we were passing in corresponds to this data object, which is our, from here, what we did on login actually, where we had, as you can see here, method headers body, again, trying to like centralize all this information into one place here. And this is just a little micro optimization and making sure we are not providing improper things into a GET request, right? Because they have like standards or specifications you're supposed to follow. Right. So here's what we can do. If the response is okay, it has a good status code, we can return whatever our response.json is, right? That is a promise, though, so I believe we'd have to write return await response JSON. Okay. And then from there, we could provide like an else statement that will then, throw a custom error of some kind or something like that. Because if the response status is not okay, then we can throw a new error. And here's where we have some choices. Remember, our server has, no matter what the response is, it took that response status code and we had our server always responding with some kind of JSON friendly object, meaning our server always responded no matter what it was, whether it was a 404, it responded with an object with error inside of it. If it was a bad token, it responded with, well, this one says message rather than error. We can account for that, right? But we know that it's a bad status code. But regardless of what happens, we throw some kind of object with a message inside of it, whether it says error or otherwise, depending on how the code is written, doesn't really matter. So we can also even bank on the fact that we have that. So I can even say response object, because typically that's what's going to be there. Or like, we can say this is our fetch response, because again, that's what that represents, where this is our actual response. And seeing this word over and over again is making me kind of kooky here. And we can say, we can await our fetch response.json body parsers to unpack the JSON data response. And then from there, if we can say if their fetch response is okay, go ahead and return that response. Otherwise, throw a new error with the response.error or response.message or something went wrong. That way we have like some options here, right? It should throw a new error with the response.error or response.message or something like that. That way we can at least console log what's going on here. So we can say even console.error, and I can say fetch error. I mean, again, this is just for what I would do in personal debugging. I would include whatever that response happens to be so I can take a look at it. This is more throwing the new error with just the string value of the response error or response message or a something went wrong, depending on which one of those ends up being true first, is just so that when I throw that error here, I can utilize it from the component. Maybe the response on the server has something that I can, I wouldn't say this to my user saying, hey, you have an invalid token signature. But, there is a chance that could be useful to us in some way or form, right? So yeah, that's just something I wanted to throw out there that we have tons of options. And again, this is why sometimes using the library is so much easier, because this is all accounted for you and written for you in a consistent way. But again, I like writing stuff by hand, at least the first go around, until I get used to understanding what's happening here. But yeah, that's just something to keep in mind, right? we can always, because our server is always coded to throw an object on response status codes that are good, I can always utilize that here in the code base, right? So there we go. What we can do now as well is write even additional functions. We don't have to do it this way. I mean, technically, this code itself is good enough to import JSON into my function, into my components, and I go ahead and run with those as is. But I like throwing extra layers here where I can say export. I got to be consistent. Export const get, right? That will return a call to JSON that will pass in the URL right there like that. String. There we go. I was wondering why I was getting angry at me here. Oh, with the method. Yeah, that's right. That makes sense. With the method of get, and there is no body, so I'm not going to provide that in there. There we go. And now I can copy this. And as you can see, this is where I'm going with here. Post, put, delete. Post, post, put, and I have to call it destroy because delete is, as y'all know, a protected keyword in JavaScript, but the string value will be delete. And when it comes to post and put requests, I should have some body. We're going to call it a payload. Again, I'm a lazy TypeScripter, so we're going to do payload any, even though I could just make it like this type right here as well, since it's going to be clearly an object with string values inside of it typically. So there. And then from there, come down yonder and say daisy chain in the payload as the body. That way the get and delete requests don't get a body, so they're not going to be on there, right? And because technically delete requests you could, but you don't need to. Yeah, we'll leave it like that for now. That's fine by me. Yeah, cool. So we pass in a URL, the method will be set up for us, and the payload we just pass in is whatever it needs to be. So again, like this is like a really nice what I call base service layer that gives me these functions in one consistent way of calling and responding with all of them across my project. It applies the tokens significantly easier across my project. It calls this function no problem. And this, as always, is enough to move on to the next step. But again, I got to complicate things always a little bit further. As y'all know, that's what I'm all about here. Let's go ahead and add a new service file called auth.ts that will take what we learned from base and apply it nicely for ourselves here. So how cool is this? So here's some things we could do. Let's aim on replacing the fetch request in, I cannot believe I've talked about this for 47 minutes and I feel like I've gotten nowhere code-wise. Welcome to coding, right? Especially trying to like explain what I'm coding with examples and analogies along the way and my decision process. So what we need to do is replace this fetch request with as clean as code as we can from utilizing our base service and an auth service that's built on top of base. So in terms of logging in, that's going to be a post request. In terms of validating the token or registering a user, there'll be get and post particularly. So we're going to need the get and post methods that I'm exporting out of base. Okay. I mean, again, I could also, I'm trying to, dang it, Luke. Got to be somewhat consistent. I like how I talk to myself in the third person with all y'all folks here. Yeah, I like having named exports, but I've been doing default exports in my examples so far, so I might as well just be consistent, even though it's not my fave. I like named imports, especially for TypeScript purposes, because it makes, I think I talked about this in a previous video, it makes it so I don't screw up and import somewhere. That's what I like to call it. As base service, we'll call it, we're going to alias it as base service. Oh, we don't have to do that. Import base service from base, and that's going to import this default object. So I have all the methods here if I need them. Now from here, we're going to call it const validate token. No, we said login first. Login user. We're going to pass in some kind of payload that'll have that. I need to have this as just a universal type across my project here. So we'll pass in an object payload that will have something like that. It's going to attempt to make a request. It will daisy chain whatever error is thrown its way, and it will simply attempt to get that token for us. So I can say token equals await post request. Nope, it's base service dot post to/auth/login, and whatever payload we have coming into the login user function will be daisy chained along the process. Why am I destructuring this? Remember, a successful login attempt gives us an object that has a property called token inside of the response right there, right? That's what that structure is like. Hence why I'm destructuring out the token. Now I realize back in storage, we never actually had a function to set it here. So should be a string value that takes the token value, which should be a string, and sets it for us. So I can say localStorage.setItem, token key, token passed in, return true, so I can do some logic, should I require to do so. Add that to our default export object here with successful syntax. There we go. And yeah, now we have a way to set it. So now I need to import this into my auth to say, I called it storage. So we're going to call it storage from up1 utilities storage. And now I can say, hey, storage, set a token with whatever token I got from my successful login. If an error happens, and hopefully if a bad status code happens, then that should be handled from our base service should throw an error, and the error will be thrown here, caught by this, and thrown up, which will trigger an error to be caught here and us to navigate and do something with, or just post a message, for example. Okay, so now that I have my auth login user ready to go, yeah, that makes sense. We'll do it this way. Okay, so now that I have that lined up, I can finally go back and change all this crap I've been writing so far into my login component. Let's bring in our handy dandy auth service that we've now written from the directory called services auth. Here's where I might choose to do like an index file in services because I want to have a lot of them, but for now, we're just going to do a specifically named path. Bring in the auth service in particular. This is the bet I have to lion that I said I'm going to do default exports and not named ones. Ugh, dealing with my own crap. Okay, so all this should hopefully be Dunyan rings, right? It shouldn't, and again, this doesn't really return anything upon a successful login, as you can see. It just said, all right, set the token and call it a day. So if it finishes the promise, it should be good to go, right? So watch this. All this code right here. There's going to be some similarities, but several key differences. I want to comment it out so we can see how much cleaner it ends up looking. Okay? The payload is what? What we were logging in with before, aka values. That was the payload we were using from our previous lecture. If it gets this far, that means someone has successfully logged in and we can do some code. If it happens to throw an error, we can do something with that error if we want to. Okay? Like a modal or a reroute or something like that. Okay? If it got this far, let's bring it in. All right, our handy dandy navigate hook. Use navigate. If it got this far, it should be able to navigate to the private page. And look how much cleaner that ends up being inside of our components here, folks, right? The auth service, log in the user, pass in the values. It sets up what? It sets up the post request to our base service with the correct URL path, daisy chain the payload, aka the email and password, into this post request. The post request is this function down here that sets up the daisy chain URL, daisy chains the payload, adds the correct method for us, calls JSON. JSON comes down over yonder, finds the token if there is one, sets us bare bones headers. If the token exists, apply it to the headers correctly using the bare scheme. It then sets up our configuration object for any given fetch request with our method, whatever our headers are, and our body. And our body is JSON stringified and added onto it. If the method is a GET request, it removes the inappropriate header and data body that doesn't need to be there on GET request. It won't work. Then it attempts to make the request to our server. It gets a response. But remember, our server has a response for even bad ones. That is always a JSON response of some kind, which means we are safe to run this code here until I'm not, until I realize there's some error or endpoint that no longer throws an error. That could be an issue we'll deal with later. The response is okay. Just go ahead and return whatever that response happens to be. If the response status code is not okay, go ahead and console log that error so I can see what's happening right here, and then throw the error and throw a new error, which will then catch it and throw the error up the chain. What is up the chain? This one will throw it back up to auth. This catch will catch it and throw that error up. This .catch will catch it and then log it should it be there. Right, so we should get an it worked, but I don't need to log what the error is because way back in base, we log what the error happens to be if there is one, right? So yeah, that is what we're looking at here in this whole process. So as you can see, we did a lot of work here, but ultimately it gave us such cleaner code inside of our components, which again, you will thank me in the long run when you're not writing this in every single component, right? That's going to be a nightmare to deal with, and this is much nicer to look at and deal with. And again, I can be working in the login component, and if something changes on my server for login logic, this will allow us to write code that I can be working on the login component, but if I need to change something on the auth logic, I can head to my global source for fetching or my global source for logging in a user and be messing in these files away from you. This is how collaboration on a project, as it gets bigger and bigger, needs to work anyway. Like the big no-no in causing Git, what's it called? When you have like Git errors or merge conflicts. My tongue is like, my mind's moving 100 miles an hour, but my mouth's not keeping up. If we have a collaboration on a project like this, then separating business logic away from the component rendering logic is crucial, because I can be working on the login component, styling it, adding new stuff to it, adding modals, state, and things like that. And if I'm working on the login component, it shouldn't mean that you cannot come and and mess and like cause a merge conflict by messing with login logic while I'm working in the same file. We've separated those out so we can work on a collaborative project together without stepping on each other's toes by working out of the same file. So finally, let's try and actually see if this all works here. I'm going to refresh. What I'm going to do is clear local storage. Okay. I'm going to hard refresh everything. We're going to go to login. That works just fine. Click on private. We get navigated back. As we can see, we got 401 unauthorized on the validate me request, evidently. That's weird because it should be a clear local storage. So if there was no token... Did I forget something? If no token, get item token. I'm surprised that the fetch request ran on this use effect and this if token statement didn't return the navigate that way. Interesting. I'll have to look into that. I wonder if that's something with how the component worked. No, it shouldn't be. Interessante, I say. I'll take a look at that later. But, okay, the point is, it did correctly get renavigated. Let's have an error in our login attempt right here. Well, okay, the it worked is the... Oh, God. I don't know why I chose it worked and the catch right here. It didn't work, clearly, right? The error worked. Oh, God. All right. There we go. That is such a confusing error message. But there is our fetch error. So there is my base service correctly recognizing that I had a problem in my request, which means I got invalid credentials as a message. So because that's my fetch error and I'm throwing that error, I can do something with that. Right? Let's go ahead and log what that error happens to be now. And it says message, so we're going to go with that. And I'm going to say error.message at this point. Okay, let's try that again. Log in with a bad request. Hey, invalid credentials. And again, now we can do something cool with that. I can bring in, I already have the useState hook. I can provide an error state now that has something akin to the following. Const error set error equals useState. False, there is no initial error that's happening in this component. We can say, if an error happens, we can say set an error to either true or maybe what that error message happens to be in this particular component's case. Okay. And then down yonder, we can provide another condition that I can say if error is true and throw some text back that says whatever that error happens to say. So initially it will be let's make it a string value. That way we're consistent here. Because it's going to be either an empty string, which is falsy, to utilize our short circuit down here. And if it happens to be set via the catch, then it should set it and display some text here. So hard refresh, bad login. I thought I logged the error message and it had that error message set there. I mean, well, error is fine to see. I think I just set it. That's interesting that it worked that way. Hold on. I could have sworn my console log. Oh, I know what happened. I'm dumb. I'm stupid. I'm stupid. I've said that more than once here. Escape. I just had the plain text that said error. The curly braces escape the JSX and use the state variable error, which should be my proper message. Man, I'm falling apart at the hour-long mark here. There we go. So there's our invalid credentials pop-up going on right there. That's what I'm talking about here, folks. Now let's go ahead and do a .com, which is successful, which should log in, and if that promise resolves fully with no error, it takes us to the private page, and we are good to go, folks. Refresh. It stays here. Everything's validated just fine. So as you know, I no longer have to run this validation code inside this component at the moment, because in the next video, we're actually going to move this logic out to instead give us a way of having a component called private that at the route level, we can wrap our components in, okay? That will make a lot more sense, right? Like I want something to wrap this component in the element of this rendered path, of this rendered route and path, to run this logic for me every single time, right? I want it to, or when the app first loads, check if they're logged in and set some kind of global value to true and allow us to be navigating around the application without having to constantly check the token, right? And again, do you want to do it at a per route level or a whole app level? Either way, the next video, I promise things will get a bit more exciting where we get back to some more React style stuff, where I will indeed start converting this private logic out to its own private route component, and we'll also talk about how to utilize context and custom hooks. So stay tuned for that next video where the real exciting stuff is going to start happening.